It was a sunny Wednesday afternoon when Mrs. Helen Johnson, an elderly black woman in her mid-70s, decided to make her usual trip to the local grocery store. Mrs. Johnson had been a regular customer at Greenfield Groceries for as long as she could remember. The store was only a 10-minute walk from her modest home in the quiet neighborhood she had lived in for the past 30 years. Despite her age, she enjoyed the simple act of getting out, walking around the store, aisles, and picking out the in-red ingredients she needed for the meals she loved to cook. Helen had seen many changes in her lifetime, but she always kept her head high, facing every challenge. With grace, she raised her children to be kind, hardworking, and proud of their roots. Now living alone, with her kids grown and settled in different cities, her days were quiet. The trips to the grocery store gave her some activity, a chance to exchange pleasantries with the employees and even strike up conversation with the other customers. That day, as Helen pushed her old metal shopping cart down the aisle filled with fresh vegetables, she felt a bit of fatigue in her legs. Her body, though, still strong, reminded her from time to time that she was no longer as actual as she used to be. She slowed down her pace, stopping by the bins of potatoes. Looking for a few to add to her basket, her arthritic hands moved carefully as she selected the ones that seemed good as she reached for a final potato. A loud voice boomed from the aisle behind her move. It lady startled, Helen turned around to see two police officers walking toward her. Both were white, large men in their early 30s with stern faces that carried no kindness. Officer Daniels, the one who had spoken, narrowed his eyes. As he approached her, "I said, move, you're blocking the aisle." Daniel said, his tongue dripping with disrespect, Helen being the polite woman. She was immediately responded. "Oh, I'm sorry, officer. I didn't realize I was in the way." She moved her cart closer to the shelves, giving them plenty of space to pass. The other officer, whose name tag read Officer Thompson, snickered but said nothing. Helen kept her head down and continued picking her groceries. She didn't want any trouble, but as she moved to the next aisle, things took a turn for the worse. Officer Daniels seemed to have no intention of letting the situation go. He followed her into the next section where the canned goods were, and feeling his presence behind her, tried to ignore him, but the tension was thick, ma'am. "You know, there's a time limit for people to finish shopping here." Daniel said, though, there was no such rule at the store. Helen, puzzled, looked at him and shook her head. "No, officer, I didn't know that." "Well, now you do." He snarled it up, officer. Thompson chuckled, again clearly finding some amusement in his partner's behavior. Helen, trying to remain calm, continued to pick out her items. She had already lived through too many experiences of being treated differently because of her skin color. But no matter how many times it happened, it still sets done. She grabbed a few cans of soup and placed them in her cart. Her hands were shaking now. It was hard to focus with the officers looming over her, like that. She thought about saying something, but she feared it might escalate the situation as she made her way toward the dairy section. Daniels and Thompson followed her, their presence becoming more intimidating with every step. Helen could feel the eyes of other shoppers on her. No one said anything, but she could sense their discomfort. The officers weren't just harassing her. They were making a spectacle of her as if she were some criminal rather than a woman just trying to buy groceries. "Why are you walking so slow?" Daniels asked, his voice sharp and impatient. "I'm an old woman, sir," Helen replied softly, "my legs don't move as fast as they used to," Daniel scoffed. "Maybe you shouldn't be out here." Then Helen felt a lump form in her throat, but she kept her head high. She wasn't going to let these men break her spirit, not after everything she had been through in her life. She had seen too much fought through, too much to be humiliated by a couple of rude officers. As she neared the milk section, Helen spotted a familiar face. It was Maria, one of the store employees who had always been kind to her. Maria was stocking shelves nearby, and she noticed the interaction between Helen and the officers. Her brows furrowed and her eyes widened in concern. Maria hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of what to do, but Helen gave her a slight reassuring smile, signaling her not to get involved. The last thing Helen wanted was for anyone else to get dragged into this unpleasant situation. Helen reached for a carton of milk, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it into her cart. As she did, Officer Daniels stepped even closer, his shadow falling over her. He was trying to intimidate her to make her feel small and powerless, but Helen wasn't going to give him that satisfaction with as much dignity as she could muster. She turned to him and said, "Officer, I'm just here to do my shopping. Please let me be Daniel." Stared at her for a moment, his jaw tight, but he didn't respond instead. Instead, he and Officer Thompson exchanged a glance before walking away, leaving Helen standing there in the AO, her heart pounding. She thought the worst was over, but little did she know it was only the beginning of what would become an unforgettable day at Greenfield Groceries. Helen took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves as the two officers walked away. She was still shaken by the way they treated her, but she wasn't going to let them ruin her day. After all, she had been through enough in her life to know that sometimes the best response was to stay calm and carry on. She turned her focus back to her shopping, determined to finish quickly and head home, where she could relax in the comfort of her cozy living room. The grocery store, once a place of peace for her, now felt suffocating, with the memory of the officers' harassment lingering. In her mind, as Helen pushed her cart toward the bakery section, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances from the other shoppers. A few people had seen what happened, but no one said a word. She understood their silence. No one wanted to get involved in something that could escalate, but it still stung. It was a reminder that sometimes, even when people see injustice, they look the other way. Helen spotted Mrs. Thompson, a neighbor. She knew from church browsing through the bread section. Mrs. Thompson was a petite, cheerful woman who always had a kind word to say. Seeing her familiar face gave Helen a small sense of comfort. "Helen, how are you today, Mrs. Thompson?" asked with a warm smile as she noticed her. "I'm all right," Helen replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just doing a little shopping." Mrs. Thompson could tell something was off. "Are you sure you seem a bit rattled?" Helen hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure the officers weren't lurking nearby. She didn't want to draw any more attention to herself, but she also felt a need to share what had just happened. Well, Helen started quietly. "I had a bit of a run-in with some officers a few minutes ago. They weren't very kind." Mrs. Thompson's smile faded, her expression turning serious. "Oh my, what did they do?" Helen recounted the story briefly, explaining how they had spoken to her rudely and followed her around the store. Mrs. Thompson listened intently, her eyes widening with every detail. "That's terrible," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You shouldn't have to deal with that." Helen nodded. "I know, but what can I do? I just want to finish my shopping and go home." "I understand," Mrs. Thompson said, placing a gentle hand on Helen's arm. "But if you need anything, don't hesitate to call me, all right?" "Thank you," Helen said with a small smile. I appreciate that they exchanged a few more pleasantries before Mrs. Thompson moved on with her shopping. Helen was grateful for her concern, but she didn't want to dwell on the incident any longer. She had already spent too much emotional energy on it as she reached for a loaf of bread. Helen noticed a young man nearby who seemed to be watching her. He was standing by the dairy section, tending to look at the milk, but occasionally glancing in her direction. Helen wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe he had seen the confrontation with the officers and was just curious. She tried to brush it off, focusing on the task at hand, but as she moved down the aisle, the young man followed her, keeping a distance. But always within sight, Helen felt her heart rate increase. She didn't want to be paranoid, but after what had just happened with the officers, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She quickly grabbed the last few items she needed and made her way to the checkout line. Glancing back to see if the young man was still there, he was. He stood near the entrance now, pretending to be on his phone, but his eyes kept darting toward her. Helen's mind raced with thoughts. Was he working with the officers? Was he another person here to harass her? She didn't want to assume the worst, but she couldn't help but feel uneasy. As she approached the cashier, Maria, the kind store employee she had seen earlier, was working the register. Maria greeted her with a smile, but her eyes quickly filled with concern as she noticed Helen's tense expression. "Mrs. Johnson, are you okay?" Maria asked softly as she began scanning the groceries. Helen hesitated, glancing over her shoulder again. The young man was still near the end entrance, now pacing slightly, but not making any move toward her. "I'm all right," Helen replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I just want to get home." Maria nodded quickly, finishing up the transaction. As she bagged the groceries, she leaned in and whispered, "I saw what happened with the officers earlier. That wasn't right. If you need help, we can call the manager or someone." Helen's heart warmed at Maria's offer, but she didn't want to make a bigger scene than what had already happened. She shook her head gently. "Thank you, Maria, but I'll be fine. I just want to leave." Maria gave a small nod and handed Helen the receipt. "All right, but please take care if you ever need anything. Don't hesitate to ask." Helen smiled, gratefully thanked Maria, and slowly pushed her cart toward the exit. Her eyes flicked back to where north of me. The young man had been standing, but he was gone now. The tension in her chest loosened slightly, but she still felt uneasy as she stepped outside into the warm afternoon. Helen glanced around the parking lot. It was busy, as usual, with cars coming and going, people loading their groceries, and children running around. Everything seemed normal. Yet the shadow of what had happened inside still lingered. Helen spotted her car parked a little ways down the lot and started walking toward it, her pace slow but steady. She wanted nothing more than to get home, lock her door, and forget about the whole ordeal. But as she reached her car and began loading her bags into the trunk, she felt a presence behind her. Her heart sank as she turned around, half expecting to see the young man or one of the officers. Instead, a large black SUV had pulled up beside her, and the windows were tinted so dark. She couldn't see who was inside. Helen's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen beside her car, staring at the black SUV. The vehicle sat eerily still, its engine quietly humming. She could feel her pulse quicken, her hands tightening around the grocery bag she was holding. There was something unsettling about the way the SUV had pulled up so close without warning, its dark windows concealing whoever was inside. For a moment, she considered walking back into the store. It would be safer there, surrounded by other people. But before she could make a move, the driver's side window rolled down slowly. A man, probably in his mid-30s, with a cold expression and dark sunglasses, peered out at her. His face was unreadable, and Helen couldn't tell if he meant her any harm. "Ma'am, do you need any help?" the man asked, his voice calm but lacking any warmth. Helen's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. "No, I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady though her heart was racing. "Just loading my groceries." The man nodded, though his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than she liked without saying another word. He rolled the window back up and slowly drove away, merging into the flow of traffic. Leaving the parking lot, Helen exhaled a shaky breath, trying to calm her nerves. Maybe he was just another shopper offering help, she thought, though her gut told her otherwise. She hurriedly finished loading her groceries, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds to make sure no one else was watching her. The whole situation, from the officers to the mysterious SUV, had left her feeling vulnerable. Once everything was packed, Helen got into her car, locking the doors as soon as she sat down. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. This day had already been more stressful than she had expected, and now even leaving the grocery store felt like a challenge. As she started her car and pulled out of the parking lot, Helen couldn't shake the thought of the man in the SUV. Something about the way he looked at her didn't sit right. She kept glancing in her rear view mirror, half expecting to see the SUV following her. But as she drove down the street, the only cars behind her seemed to be ordinary, with no sign of the dark vehicle. The familiar streets of her neighborhood were usually comforting, but today they felt oddly quiet. Helen tried to push the day's events out of her mind, focusing instead on getting home safely. She just needed to get home, put away the groceries, and forget about everything. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed her neighbor, Mr. Evans, out on his porch. He was a retired school teacher, always friendly and polite. Seeing his familiar face was a small comfort. After everything that had happened afternoon, Mr. Evans called out with a wave as she stepped out of the car. "Afternoon, Mr. Evans," Helen replied, forcing a smile. She didn't want to worry him with what had happened earlier. "You need a hand with those groceries," he offered, noticing her full trunk. "No, thank you. I've got it." She said, but I appreciate the offer. Mr. Evans nodded and returned to his porch, leaving Helen to her thoughts. She quickly unloaded the groceries, her eyes darting around the neighborhood, still on edge from the incident at the store. Every sound, a car driving by, a door closing, made her jump. She hated feeling like this, as though she couldn't trust her surroundings. Once inside, Helen locked the door and set the groceries on the kitchen counter. The quiet of her home was a welcome relief, but the tension in her body refused to go away. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her, like a protective blanket. But even in the safety of her home, her mind kept replaying the events of the day. The officers, the young man, the soothe. It was all too much. Helen sat down at the kitchen table, resting her head in her hands. She had dealt with racism throughout her life, but something about today's encounter with the officers felt different, like it wasn't just an isolated incident, but the start of something more sinister. After a few minutes, she stood up and began putting away the groceries, trying to distract herself with the mundane task. But her thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened. Why had those officers targeted her? She hadn't done anything wrong. They didn't even have a reason to approach her, yet they treated her like she was some sort of criminal. As she put the last item in the fridge, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from her granddaughter, Jasmine. "Hey, Grandma, just checking in everything." Okay, Helen smiled softly at the message. Jasmine was always looking out for her. Even though she lived across town and was busy with work and school, Helen thought about telling Jasmine what had happened, but she didn't want to worry her. Besides, there wasn't much that could be done now. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just got back from the store. How are you?" She hit send and placed the phone down, trying to push the days, events to the back of her mind, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Helen had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to endure and move forward. Despite the challenges, life threw her way, but today had left her shaken in a way she hadn't felt in years. As she stood by the window, looking out at the peaceful street, a thought crossed her mind. What if this wasn't over? What if there was more to come? Helen shook her head, trying to dismiss the idea. She was probably just overthinking things. Still, the knot of anxiety in her chest wouldn't loosen. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. It was Jasmine. "I'm doing good, Grandma. I'll come by tomorrow to see you," Helen smiled, feeling a bit more at ease. Jasmine's visits always lifted her spirits. Maybe tomorrow would be a better day. Maybe today's events were just a fluke, but deep down, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next day arrived, but Helen couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. She had barely slept the night before. Her thoughts replaying the moments at the grocery store. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer faces, their creepy smiles. The way they had looked at her as if she didn't belong, the encounter had left a mark on her, and no matter how hard she tried, the incident kept creeping into her thoughts. By mid-morning, Jasmine was at the door, a wide smile on her face as she hugged her grandmother tightly. Helen hadn't told her about the incident yet, deciding she'd rather wait until they were settled before bringing it up. "Grandma, it's so good to see you," Jasmine said, her arms wrapped around Helen. Jasmine was in her early 20s, full of energy and always quick to bring light into the room. She was the kind of granddaughter every grandmother wished for, thoughtful, caring, and always ready to listen. "It's good to see you too, sweetheart," Helen replied, hugging her back just as tightly. Having Jasmine here, even if just for a little while, made her feel more grounded. "Come on in. Let me make us some tea." They walked into the cozy living room. The warm sunlight streaming through the windows, the familiarity of the space combined with Jasmine's presence started to calm Helen down. Maybe today was the day she could finally relax. As they sat down with their tea, Jasmine looked at her grandmother closely. "You look a little tired." "Grandma, everything okay?" Helen hesitated. She didn't want to worry Jasmine, but keeping the whole situation to herself wasn't helping either. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Something happened yesterday at the grocery store." Jasmine's brow furrowed in concern. "What do you mean?" "What happened?" Helen explained everything, how the officers had approached her without cause, how they had treated her with such disdain. She even mentioned the strange encounter with the man in the black suit. She described it all in detail, trying not to leave anything out as she spoke. She could see the worry growing in Jasmine's eyes. They had no reason to bother me. Helen finished, her voice shaking slightly, but they did just because of how I look. I've dealt with racism before, but it's been years since something like this happened to me. It made me feel powerless. Jasmine reached across the table, taking her grandmother's hands in her own. "Grandma, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said softly. "That's awful, and it's not right." "I know," Helen replied, squeezing Jasmine's hands, "but what bothers me more is this feeling I've had since it happened, like something's not finished. Yet I can't shake the feeling that those officers weren't just doing this randomly. There was something more to it." Jasmine's expression turned serious. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it," Helen admitted, "but it's like they were trying to send a message. I don't know why or how, but the way they looked at me, it wasn't just casual, it felt personal." Jasmine frowned, her protective instincts kicking in. "Did you report them?" "No, I didn't," Helen said, shaking her head. "I didn't see the point. Who would believe me over a couple of cops? But Grandma, they can't get away with that," Jasmine insisted. "You don't deserve to be treated like that." "Nobody does," Helen sighed, feeling the weight of it. "All again, I know. But what am I supposed to do? Fight the whole system? It feels like I'd be fighting a losing battle." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She didn't want her grandmother to feel this way, but she also understood Helen's hesitation. The system wasn't exactly designed to protect people like her. People who looked like her. Jasmine had seen it herself in her own life, though not to the same extent. Still, she couldn't let this slide. "What if we did something?" Jasmine suggested, her voice more determined now. "Maybe we could get someone to listen if enough people know what happened. Maybe something will change." Helen looked at her granddaughter, a soft smile on her lips. "Sweetheart, I appreciate that, I really do, but I don't want to make a bigger mess out of this than it already is. I'm just worried about you," Grandma Jasmine said. "What if this happens again, or what if those officers come back? You shouldn't have to feel like this." "In your own community," Helen nodded, understanding Jasmine's concern. She hadn't even considered that the officers might come back. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Would they try to intimidate her again? Could they make her life more difficult just because they could? She hated that the possibility even crossed her mind for the rest of the afternoon. They talked about lighter things, Jasmine's classes, her plans for the future. But every now and then, Helen's mind wandered back to the officers, to that strange soothe, to the way her world had shifted ever so slightly after the incident. It wasn't just about the groceries anymore. It was about something bigger, something that was hard to put into words by the time Jasmine left that evening. Helen was feeling a little better. Jasmine had always had that effect on her, making things seem less overwhelming just by being there. But as she sat alone in the quiet house, Helen couldn't help but feel that something was still lurking just out of sight, something unfinished. She got up and locked the door, checking the windows just to be safe. The night outside was calm, but the unease in her chest remained. Helen wasn't the type to let fear rule her, but this was different. This was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Like a storm was gathering on the horizon, and she didn't know when it would hit. As she made her way to bed, Helen tried to convince herself that tomorrow would be better. Maybe everything would settle down and she could go back to her normal routine. Maybe the officers had forgotten about her and the soothe was just a random coincidence, but deep down Helen knew that wasn't true. Something had been set in motion and she had no idea how to stop it. The next morning, Helen woke up feeling a bit drowsy. The restless sleep from the night before had left her tired, but she knew she couldn't spend the day dwelling on what happened. As much as the situation at the grocery store bothered her, she had other things to tend to. Life didn't stop for moments of unfairness. No matter how big or small they were, Helen got dressed and made her way to the kitchen. She decided to keep her mind busy by preparing her favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and a small bowl of fresh fruit. Cooking had always been a comfort to her, a way to focus her energy on something positive. As the eggs sizzled in the pan, She tried to push thoughts of the police officers out of her mind, but even as she moved through her routine, the anxiety lingered just below the surface. It was as if the simple act of going outside had turned into something risky. Could she really trust that nothing would happen again? Could she go back to her normal life without feeling watched? As Helen sat down at the table to eat, she picked up the phone to call her friend Margaret. They had known each other for years, meeting up regularly to chat over coffee or lunch. Margaret was the kind of friend who always knew the right thing to say, and Helen needed that kind of support. Now, more than ever after a few rings, Margaret's familiar voice came through the line. "Helen, it's so good to hear from you. How have you been?" "I'm fine," Margaret Helen replied, though her voice didn't quite match her words. "Well, mostly fine. I've been meaning to tell you something. What's going on?" Margaret asked instantly, picking up on the change in Helen's tone. "You don't sound." Like yourself, Helen took a deep breath and told her friend everything: the grocery store, the police officers, the man in the SUV. She didn't leave anything out. The more she spoke, the more the weight seemed to lift off her shoulders. It felt good to share it with someone who would understand. By the time she finished, Margaret was silent for a moment. Processing everything, "Helen, that's terrible." She finally said, "You didn't deserve any of that." "What's wrong with those people? I don't know," Helen replied, shaking her head, even though Margaret couldn't see it. "I wish I had the answer. It just felt so deliberate, like they were targeting me on purpose." "Racism is still alive and well, unfortunately," Margaret said, her voice tinged with anger. "It doesn't matter how far we've come. There are still people out there who think they're above others just because of the color of their skin." Helen nodded, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. She had hoped that the world would have changed more by now, that these kinds of incidents would be a thing of the past. But here she was facing it again in her own community. Margaret sighed. On the other end of the line, "You know you don't have to handle this on your own." "Helen, we could go to the community center, talk to some people there. Maybe they can help." "I've thought about that," Helen admitted, "but I don't want to make things worse." "How could you make things worse by standing up for yourself?" Margaret asked, her voice firm but caring. "These officers need to be held accountable. If they're treating you this way, they're probably doing it to others too." Helen appreciated Margaret's support, but part of her still hesitated. The idea of bringing more attention to the situation made her uneasy. She didn't want to stir up trouble, but at the same time, she knew that staying silent might not be the best option. "I'll think about it," Helen said, trying to reassure her friend. "I just need some time to figure out what to do next." "Take all the time you need," Margaret replied gently, "but don't let this eat away at you. You deserve better than that." After they hung up, Helen sat quietly for a while, staring out the window. The morning sun was bright, casting long shadows across her small garden. It was a peaceful scene, but the turmoil inside her wouldn't let her enjoy it. She knew Margaret was right. She couldn't let the fear and anger fest her, but she wasn't sure she was ready to take the next step later that afternoon. Helen decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. She figured some fresh air might clear her head as she strolled down the quiet streets. She noticed a few of her neighbors working in their yards. She waved politely, exchanging brief hellos as she passed by, but as she continued walking, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every car that drove by seemed to make her tense up, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once. She hated feeling this way, like she couldn't even take a simple walk without worrying about being watched or followed. Eventually, she made her way to the small park near her house. It was a peaceful spot with a few benches and a walking path that wounded around a patch of trees. Helen sat down on one of the benches, letting out a long breath as she tried to relax. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her heart race across the street. Parked just behind the line of trees was the same black SUV she had seen at the grocery store. The windows were tinted, and the car seemed to blend into the shadows. But there was no mistaking it. Helen's mind raced. Was it just a coincidence, or had she been followed? She tried to stay calm, telling herself that it was probably nothing, but as she sat there, the SUV didn't move. It just stayed parked, as if watching her. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she got up from the bench, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. She tried to act normal, walking calmly back toward her house, but the sense of being watched clung to her like a shadow. By the time she reached her front door, Helen's pulse was racing. She locked the door behind her and peeked out the window, but the SUV was gone. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Helen with more questions than answers. Something wasn't right, and Helen knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. Helen paced back and forth. In her living room, her mind racing with thoughts, the sight of that black SUV parked near the park had unsettled her in a way she hadn't expected. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, watched by unseen eyes. It wasn't just paranoia, something was wrong, and she could feel it deep in her bones. As the day wore on, she tried to distract herself with little tasks around the house. She cleaned the kitchen, watered her plants, and even spent some time organizing her closet. But no matter how much she tried to focus on other things, the memory of the grocery store encounter and the black SUV kept creeping back into her mind. The thought that those officers could be targeting her made her uneasy. By the time evening rolled around, Helen found herself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She wasn't really watching it. Her mind was too busy replaying everything that had happened. She knew she couldn't keep living in fear, but she didn't know what to do next. Should she report it? Should she confront the officers? Or should she just try to move on and hope this would all blow over? Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. Helen reached for it, expecting it to be Margaret checking in on her, but when she looked at the screen, she saw an unknown number hesitant. She answered hello. She said cautiously, "Is this Helen Johnson?" A stern male voice on the other end asked, "Yes, this is she who's..." Calling Helen replied her heart starting to race. "Again, this is Officer Daniels from the local police department. We'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident at the grocery store. The other day, the officer said," his tone, cold and professional. Helen's stomach dropped. Why were the police calling her now? And why did it feel like something more was going on? Sure, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you need to know?" "We've received some information regarding your behavior at the store and would like to discuss it with you. Can you come down to the station tomorrow morning?" Officer Daniels asked. Helen was taken aback. Her behavior? What could they possibly be talking about? She had done nothing wrong. "Wait, what do you mean my behavior?" "I was the one who was harassed at the store," Helen said, her voice rising slightly in frustration. "I understand you might feel that way." "Ma'am," the officer replied, his tone still distant and formal, "but we have a duty to investigate all sides of the situation. We'll discuss it in more detail when you come in." Helen's mind raced. She didn't trust the situation, but she didn't want to make things worse by refusing. After a moment of silence, she reluctantly agreed to meet with the officers the next morning. As soon as she hung up, a wave of anxiety washed over her. This was starting to feel bigger than she had thought, and she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever was coming next. That night, Helen barely slept. Her mind was too preoccupied with what might happen at the station. She kept replaying the grocery store incident in her head, trying to figure out what she had done that could warrant this kind of attention. But no matter how hard she thought about it, she couldn't come up with anything. The next morning, Helen got dressed and prepared to head to the police station. She wore her best clothes, hoping to make a good impression, but deep down, she was filled with dread. The idea of walking into that building, knowing the officers she was about to face, might be the same ones who harassed her at the store made. Her stomach turned. Before leaving, Helen called Margaret to let her know where she was going. "I'm heading to the station," she said, trying to sound calm. "They want to ask me some questions about the grocery store incident." "You're going alone?" Margaret asked, clearly concerned. "I'll be fine." Helen replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "It's probably just a formality. I'll call you when it's over." Margaret insisted on going with her, but Helen didn't want to drag her friend into the situation. She thanked her for the offer and promised to keep her updated when Helen arrived at the station. Her heart pounded in her chest. The building was imposing with its high walls and cold, sterile atmosphere. She took a deep breath and walked inside, approaching the front desk. "I'm here to see Officer Daniels." She said, her voice steady despite the fear building inside her. The receptionist nodded and pointed her toward a waiting area. "Heck be with you shortly," she said. Helen sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she waited. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. She couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of trap, if they were trying to intimidate her into silence. Finally, after what felt like hours, Officer Daniels appeared. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a stern expression that didn't offer any reassurance. He motioned for Helen to follow him into a small interrogation room. The walls were bare, and the light overhead cast a harsh glow over the metal table and chairs. "Please have a seat, officer," Daniel said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Helen sat down, trying to keep her composure. She could feel the tension in the air. As Officer Daniels took his seat across from her, "We're here to discuss the events that took place at the grocery store." He began folding, his hands on the table. "We've received complaints about your behavior, and we need to clarify a few things." Helen's jaw clenched. Complaints about her behavior. This was getting more ridiculous by the minute. "With all due respect, officer, I was the one who was being bullied by your colleagues," Helen said, her voice firm but controlled. "They harassed me for no reason, and now you're telling me I'm the one under investigation." Officer Daniels didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room was deafening. "We're not here to make any assumptions," he finally said, his tone cold, "but we need to hear your side of the story." Helen took a deep breath and began recounting everything that had happened at the store, from the moment she entered to the moment she left. She didn't leave out a single detail, making sure to emphasize how the officers had singled her out, how they had treated her with disrespect. When she finished off, Officer Daniels remained quiet for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, without offering any indication of where the conversation was headed, he stood up. "Thank you for your time," he said, his tone still as distant as ever. "We'll be in touch." Helen blinked, confused. That was it. No explanation, no resolution. She had been expecting more, but instead she was left with even more questions than before. As Helen left the station, her mind was spinning. The brief encounter with Officer Daniels had left her more confused than ever. The way he had brushed off her account of the grocery store incident made her feel like she was being swept under the rug, as though her words didn't matter. Her footsteps echoed on the pavement as she made her way to her car, frustration bubbling inside her sitting. In the driver's seat, Helen took a deep breath. She tried to collect her thoughts, but the more she replayed the conversation in her mind, the more it all felt wrong. They had called her in, questioned her, but had given her no answers. It felt like they weren't even interested in finding out the truth. Instead, they seemed determined to make her the problem as she drove back home. The silence in her car was heavy. Helen didn't turn on the radio. She couldn't even focus on the sounds around her. Her mind was elsewhere, back at the grocery store, back to those moments of humiliation and fear. She had thought that going to the police might bring her some kind of resolution, but now it only felt like she had stepped into something much bigger and far more unsettling. When she got home, she parked in her driveway and just sat in her car. For a moment, staring out the windshield, the quiet of her neighborhood with its neat lawns and quiet streets felt worlds apart from the chaos swirling. In her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on, something that she couldn't yet see. But what was it? Helen decided to call Margaret. Her friend had been so supportive through everything, and she needed someone to talk to. As the phone rang, she felt a knot of tension tightening in her chest. "Hello," Margaret's voice was warm and familiar. "Margaret." "It's me," Helen said, her voice sounding more tired than she intended. "I just got back from the station." Margaret's tone shifted immediately. "What happened? Did they explain anything?" "No," Helen sighed. "They asked me a bunch of questions, but it felt more like an interrogation than anything else. They didn't give me any answers. It's like they're trying to turn this all around on me." "That's ridiculous," Margaret explained, clearly outraged. "You're the victim in all of this." "What are they playing at?" "I don't know," Helen said quietly, But it doesn't feel right. I'm starting to think this is more than just a few bad cops being racist. There's something else going on. Margaret was silent for a moment, thinking, do you think it's something deeper, like they're trying to cover something up? I don't know, Helen replied, but it's starting to feel that way. The two women talked for a while longer, trying to make sense of the situation. Margaret offered to come over, but Helen declined. She appreciated her friend's support, but she needed some time alone to process everything after they hung up. Helen sat on her couch, staring at the walls of her home, which now felt like a safe haven. Amidst the turmoil, days passed and life continued as normal, or at least as normal as it could be for Helen. She tried to focus on her usual routine, grocery shopping, church events, taking care of her plants, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered, like a shadow. The black soothe that had followed her days earlier didn't reappear, but that didn't mean she stopped looking over her shoulder every time she went out. She felt as though someone was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The grocery store had become a place of anxiety, no longer a simple errand. She noticed people staring at her more often, though she wasn't sure if it was her imagination or if others had picked up on the tension. One afternoon, Helen decided to go for a walk to clear her head. She put on her comfortable shoes and set off down the quiet streets of her neighborhood. The fresh air helped ease the tension in her body, and for a brief moment, she was able to push aside her worries as she rounded the corner. She noticed something odd. A police car was parked across the street. Its engine idling, the sight of it made her stomach flip. She couldn't tell if the officers inside were watching her, but the car's presence felt too coincidental. It was as though they were making sure she knew they were there, watching. Waiting, Helen quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to seem paranoid, but at the same time she knew that what she was feeling wasn't just in her head. Something was wrong. She just didn't know what. By the time she got home, her nerves were frayed. She double-checked her locks, made sure all the windows were shut tight, and drew the curtains. She couldn't shake the feeling that the police were trying to intimidate her into silence, to make her think twice about speaking up or taking any further action. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. Her mind was too busy, thinking about the grocery store, the police station, the strange police car parked outside. Why were they targeting her? What were they trying to hide? And more importantly, what should she do? Next, she considered reaching out to a lawyer, someone who could help her navigate this mess, but she hesitated. Helen wasn't the type to stir up trouble. She had always lived her life quietly, never wanting to make waves, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for herself, for her dignity, for what was right. The next morning, she decided to visit the community center. It was a place where people in the neighborhood gathered to discuss local issues and support one. Another Helen thought that maybe, just maybe, she could find some guidance there. Someone had to know what was going on, or at least how she could protect herself. When she arrived at the center, it was bustling with people. She recognized a few familiar faces and felt a small sense of comfort. She wasn't alone in this. There were people in the community who cared, who would stand by her if things got worse. Helen spotted a group of women sitting together, their heads bent in conversation. One of them was Mrs. Thompson, a kind woman in her 60s who had been active in local activism for years. Helen approached them, feeling a little more hopeful. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I was wondering if I could talk to you for a moment." The woman looked up and smiled warmly. "Of course, Helen. What's on your mind?" Helen hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to begin, but she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had to speak up, no matter how hard it was. "It's about the police," she began slowly. "Something happened at the grocery store." Helen sat across from Mrs. Thompson, feeling the weight of the moment. She had never been one to speak openly about her struggles, especially when it came to something so personal and so painful, but now she had no choice. She had been carrying this burden for days, and it was becoming too much to bear alone. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward slightly, her eyes full of concern and curiosity. The other women at the table fell silent, sensing that what Helen was about to share was serious. The room around them buzzed with activity. but in this small circle, it felt like time had slowed. "Take your time, Helen," Mrs. Thompson said gently. "We're here to listen," Helen nodded, gathering her thoughts. She started from the beginning, recounting the day at the grocery store. When everything had changed, she told them about how she had been minding her own business, just trying to buy a few groceries. When the two officers had approached her, she described their hostility, the way they had humiliated her in front of everyone, and how she had felt so powerless. In that moment, the women listened intently, their expressions growing more serious as Helen continued. Mrs. Thompson's face hardened with each word, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as if she was trying to contain her anger. "And when I tried to report it," Helen said, her voice breaking slightly, "they didn't even take me seriously. It was like I was the one in the wrong." A murmur of outrage rippled through the group. One of the women, a younger lady named Anita, shook her head in disbelief. "How can they treat you like that?" "You did nothing wrong," Helen shrugged, feeling the frustration welling up again. "I don't know, I've always kept to myself. I've never caused any trouble, but now it feels like they're targeting me. And I don't know why." Mrs. Thompson spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about you, Helen. It's about something bigger. This kind of thing has been happening to people in our community for a long time. They think they can push us around because they don't expect us to fight back." Helen felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of hope. "But what can I do? I've tried to talk to the police, but they don't care. They're the ones doing this." Mrs. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, and you're right to feel frustrated. But you're not alone in this. We've been fighting this kind of injustice. For years, it may seem like a losing battle sometimes, but we've made progress and we can't stop." Now Anita chimed in. "We need to make sure people hear your story. Helen, the police can't just get away with treating you like this." "But how?" Helen asked. "I've already tried talking to them. I went to the station and they acted like I was wasting their time." Mrs. Thompson smiled, though it was a sad smile, one filled with the weight of experience. "There are other ways to fight back. We can bring this to the attention of the community. The more people who know about what happened, the harder it will be for them to sweep it under the rug." Helen felt a surge of anxiety at the thought of her situation becoming even more public. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, let alone in such a painful and humiliating way. But she also knew that staying silent would only let the officers continue their behavior unchecked. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Helen admitted. "It's already been so hard." "I understand," Mrs. Thompson said, her tone softening. "But remember, you don't have to do this alone. We'll stand with you. We'll make sure your voice is heard." The other women around the table nodded in agreement. Helen looked at each of them, feeling a sense of solidarity that she hadn't expected for the first time in days. She felt like she wasn't carrying this burden by herself. Maybe, just maybe, she could find the strength to stand up for herself. The conversation shifted to more practical matters. They discussed how to bring attention to Helen's story, starting with a meeting at the community center, where she could share her experience. Mrs. Thompson also mentioned reaching out to local organizations that specialized in civil rights issues. Helen's story, as painful as it was, needed to be part of a larger fight for justice. As they talked, Helen's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Watch your back." Her hands trembled. As she read the message again, it was short, just 3 words, but the meaning was clear. Someone was trying to scare her into silence. She showed the message to Mrs. Thompson, who frowned deeply. "Who would do something like this?" Helen whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Thompson looked at the phone, then back at Helen. "It could be anyone. Someone who doesn't want you speaking out, but don't let it stop you." "That's exactly what they want." Helen nodded, though fear was creeping into her heart. She had already felt so vulnerable, and now it seemed like someone was actively watching her, trying to intimidate her into backing down. But what choice did she have? If she stayed quiet, nothing would change, and if she spoke up, she wasn't sure what would happen next. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and preparation. Helen spent hours going over what she would say at the community meeting, unsure if she could handle the pressure. Mrs. Thompson checked in with her regularly, offering advice and reassurance. The text message still lingered in the back of Helen's mind, but she tried to push it aside, focusing on the task at hand. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, Helen felt a knot of nerves twisting in her stomach. The community center was filled with familiar faces, people she had seen at church or in the neighborhood over the years. But today, they were all here for a different reason. They were here to listen. Helen stood at the front of the room, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the silence in the room as everyone waited for her to speak. She took a deep breath and began, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I never thought I'd be standing here talking about something like this," she began. "But what happened to me at the grocery store wasn't just an isolated incident. It's part of something bigger, and we can't stay silent anymore." The community center buzzed with energy as more people filed into the room. Helen had never seen it so full before. Word had spread quickly about the meeting, and it seemed like everyone wanted to be there to support her. Mrs. Thompson stood nearby, organizing the speakers for the event, while Helen nervously paced in the small room behind the stage. She wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people, let alone about something so personal. Her heart raced and her palms were slick with sweat. She could hear the low murmur of voices from the audience and feel the anticipation building. The memory of that text still lingered. In the back of her mind, "Watch your back." The message had been short, but it carried a heavy weight. Someone didn't want her to tell her story, and that fact alone made her even more determined to do so. Mrs. Thompson poked her head into the room. "It's almost time," she said with a warm smile. "You ready, Helen?" Took a deep breath, nodded, and walked out to the stage. As she stepped onto the platform, the room went quiet. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, all waiting to hear what she had to say. The silence was deafening, and for a moment she wondered if she could go through with it, but then she remembered why she was there. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had experienced injustice and had been too scared to say anything. She glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who gave her a reassuring nod. Helen cleared her throat and stepped up to the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, the words began to flow more. "Naturally, I didn't want to be here today," Helen started. "I didn't want to be the person standing in front of all of you talking about what happened. But staying silent, that's not an option anymore." The audience was completely still, hanging on her every word. "I was just minding my own business." That day, Helen continued, her voice growing steadier. "I went to the grocery store like I always do, but something was different this time. The moment I walked in, I could feel their eyes on me. 2 police officers. I didn't know why they were watching me, but I could feel it. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, as if they knew the feeling all too well. They followed me," Helen said, her voice catching in her throat. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, but they followed me anyway. And when I asked them why, they laughed in my face. They didn't care. They didn't care about me or what was right. They just wanted to intimidate me, and it worked." I was scared. A murmur of agreement swept through the room, and Helen could see the anger building in their eyes. She wasn't the only one who had been treated this way. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. "They harassed me in front of everyone," she continued. "They called me names, they insulted me, and they tried to make me feel small. But I refused to be small, not anymore." The crowd erupted into applause, and Helen felt a surge of energy course through her. She wasn't just telling her story. She was giving a voice to the countless others who had been silenced. But it didn't end there. She said, her voice lowering after I left the store. "I went to the police station to report them. I thought that if I told the truth, something would be done, but nothing happened. They didn't care. They brushed me off just like the officers had done. And that's when I realized they think they can get away with this because they've been getting away with it." For years, the room was electric with tension. Now the audience hanging on every word. "I'm tired of it," Helen said firmly. "I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter. And I know I'm not the only one. That's why we have to stand together. That's why we can't let them silence us anymore. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, putting a hand on Helen's shoulder. "You're right," she said, addressing the crowd. "This isn't just about Helen. This is about all of us. We've been silent for too long. It's time to make some noise." The audience erupted in cheers, and for the first time in a long while, Helen felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things could change. Maybe they could fight back. But as the applause died down, Helen's phone buzzed again. She glanced down and froze another message. This one was even more chilling than the last, you think. "You're safe. Now think again." Her heart pounded in her chest as she showed the message to Mrs. Thompson. The older woman's face hardened, but she quickly regained her composure. "They're trying to scare you," she said quietly. "Don't let them. We're not backing down." Helen nodded, though fear gripped her. The meeting continued, with other speakers taking the stage to share their own experiences of injustice. The crowd was passionate, energized, and ready to take action, but in the back of her mind, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Someone out there didn't want her to continue, and she had no idea what they would do. Next, Helen was still shaken by the threatening message, but she couldn't let it stop her. She left the community center with a mix of determination and fear, knowing that something had to change. The city was buzzing with her story, and now she had to take the next step. In the days that followed, Helen received numerous messages of support from strangers and friends alike. The local media had picked up her story, and it seemed like everyone wanted to hear what she had to say. Her story had become a symbol of resistance, and people were rallying behind her. Despite the support, Helen remained on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. The message she received after the meeting had unnerved her, and every unexpected noise made her jump, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. The grocery store, the incident happened, was a central part of her story, and Helen decided she needed to go back there. She wasn't going to let fear control her life with Mrs. Thompson by her side. She walked back into the store to show that she wasn't afraid. As they entered, Helen felt the weight of the stares from the employee and customers. It was clear that the store was on high alert. The officers who had bullied her were not on duty that day, but Helen's presence made it clear that the story wasn't going away. She approached the manager, a tall man with a stern face. "I'm here to talk," she said firmly, about what happened here. The manager hesitated but nodded. "Let him go to my office." Helen and Mrs. Thompson followed him to a small office at the back of the store. The manager closed the door behind them and sat behind his desk. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Helen began. "I want to make sure that the officers who harassed me are held accountable." The manager looked uncomfortable. "We're taking this seriously. The officers are no longer working here, but we're investigating what happened." Helen wasn't satisfied with just words. "I want more than just an investigation. I want an assurance that nothing like this will ever happen again." The manager shifted uncomfortably. "We're doing our best. It's a process." Helen's patience was wearing thin. "This is more than just a process. This is about people's lives. My life and I want to make sure you're doing everything you can to make sure this doesn't happen again." The conversation ended with promises, but no concrete actions. Helen left the store feeling as though she hadn't achieved much, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Her next step was to make sure the story stayed in the spotlight. Her actions caught the attention of a local activist group, and they reached out to her, offering their support. They were known for their work in fighting against police brutality and racial discrimination, and they wanted to collaborate with Helen to keep the pressure on the authorities. Helen met with the group in a small, dimly lit office. The room was filled with passionate individuals who shared her frustration and determination. They discussed strategies and plans to ensure that her story reached even more people. One of the activists, a young woman named Maya, suggested organizing a march. "We need to show the city that we're not backing down." She said a march will bring people together and make sure our voices are heard. Helen agreed. A march could be a powerful way to demonstrate solidarity and demand justice. The group began planning the event, and soon flyers and posters were plastered around town calling for everyone to join. In the march, the day of the march arrived, and Helen stood at the front with Mrs. Thompson and Maya. The crowd gathered in front of the city hall, holding signs and chanting slogans for justice. Helen felt a rush of adrenaline as she looked out at the sea of face, all united for the same cause. The march was a success, drawing a large crowd and generating significant media coverage. Helen spoke to the press, reiterating her demand for justice and accountability. Her words were powerful and clear, and they resonated with many who had felt the same way, but had never found the courage to speak out. The day after the march, Helen received another message. This time, it was different from the others. It read, "You've stirred up a lot of trouble. We're watching you, Helen," showed the message to Maya and Mrs. Thompson. Their faces were grave, but they remained resolute. "We can't let them intimidate us." Maya said, "We've come too far." Despite the threats, Helen continued her campaign. She met with city officials, lobbied for policy changes, and attended community meetings. Her determination never wavered, and her story continued to inspire others to speak out against injustice. As the weeks went by, the initial tension around the store and the officers seemed to fade, but Helen knew that the real work was just beginning. She had to keep pushing for change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had faced similar challenges. Her courage and resolve made a significant impact on her community. People were more aware of the issues she had highlighted and were more willing to stand up and speak out. Helen's fight wasn't over, but she had shown that even in the face of fear and intimidation, one person's voice could make a difference. The story of Helen and her bravery continued to inspire people, reminding everyone that standing up against injustice was worth every effort, no matter the cost.